In Mundus, conflict and disparity are what bring change, and change is the most sacred of the 11 forces. Change is the force without focus or origin. The Elder Scrolls. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to welcome everyone to this episode. It's the final episode of our kind of sci-fi, fantasy, horror specials that we're doing for October, while I've been working pretty steadily on Season 3. And this is the last of these episodes for a time. Next week we will return to those history episodes. I've gotten scripts, or outlines I should say, pretty well done for the first 2 or 3 episodes, and I'm looking forward to getting back to those. So they'll be starting again next week. I will say the week of the 13th, that episode that would normally come out on the 14th may be a little delayed. I have a wedding that weekend, and I should be back in time to record it, but the question is, will I feel like recording it? So we'll see. But for this week, from the quote is from a in-world book known as the Monomyth, and that is a quote from numerous lore books that show up in a few different games in this world we're going to be talking about, and that is the world of the Elder Scrolls. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Elder Scrolls is a mostly role-playing fantasy world that was originally released, I believe, in 1995. I think is when the first game came out, Elder Scrolls Arena, 94. And it was released by what was at the time known as Bethesda Softworks. That has since, of course, become Bethesda Studios, which is now, I think, a subsidiary of Xbox. But they, of course, have appeared on multiple consoles as well as PCs. Now, this is a massive world, and it's probably, I wouldn't say, it's probably not the most, probably not the greatest RPG series, but in my opinion, as a world, as a kind of a lore and a mythos, it's definitely the most interesting, at least among Western RPGs, if not the entire world. The games have consistently scored pretty well. I think there are a couple of less well received entries, but nothing that is part of the main, storyline or lore. Now, this is a little bit different from most of our stuff. This world is very much a collaborative effort. It is not part of a single creator that then had additions made to it, such as the World of Ice and Fire, which of course was mostly written by George R. R. Martin, but he did have a little bit of help fleshing some stuff out in that. But the world is completely his. And then you have something like there's an alarm going off in the background. I hope you can't hear that. Then you have, of course, the world of Glorantha, which was created by an individual, but as it was part of a kind of an RPG world, it has been expanded on by multiple people. It's just more of a setting. But Elder Scrolls, again, is a collaborative effort. It's created by that studio. It was initially actually played as part of a in-house D&D session from several of the programmers. And the world is known as Tamriel, but it can also be referred to as Nirn or Mundus. But the original game was very much inspired by this kind of in-house Dungeons and Dragons session homebrew that they had come up with. Because it descends from Dungeons and Dragons, it of course descends from a little bit of Tolkien. There are definitely aspects of Tolkien that come through in this, especially when it comes to the races that inhabit the world of Tamriel. But they do take their own spins on things. They definitely change how it works. And whereas Tolkien's is very much a very Christian monotheistic based work, their world is much more reliant on a kind of Gnosticism based theology and mythology, as well as some elements of reincarnation from Hinduism and Buddhism. Just a bit for those, but it's more Gnostic than anything else. And we're going to go further into those types of things later when we get to actual Gnosticism. But it does play on kind of the idea that there is we talked about the San religions already, how they have Kagan or Kagan, who is very much a demiurge, a god who did not create existence, but who created the physical or material world as kind of a, not necessarily a prank, but just as something that almost not necessarily a whim, but just something that was new, something that only they could do, or that they wanted to kind of change the nature of reality. And that is the case in the Elder Scrolls, and we'll kind of go into that in a moment. Apologies for that edit. There was several police cars driving by in the background, so I decided to cut. Yes, so this world kind of combines several different sources. Now, one thing that kind of stands out about the real world game is, at least initially, the game itself, the first game in the series, which is the Elder Scrolls Arena, was actually fairly derivative. It wasn't by any means unique. It was very kind of in the veins of several other kind of dungeon crawling RPG sections, but it was massive. It was very big, and that is something that has kind of stuck with the series as time has gone on. The second game of the series, Daggerfall, was massive for its size. The world size based on your character model and how big the world you could explore was, that it basically it equates to a world the size of Great Britain, and it was the first truly 3D engines that actually ran. So it had like 1,500 towns, and like I think it was populated with like almost a million NPCs. Now, it should be very clear that while that's true, a lot of the world is completely empty. It's kind of procedurally generated, so it's very impressive from a technical standpoint. At least when it was made, it was on DOS, so it is not to be scoffed at, especially for when it was made. However, these days it would not seem that impressive. And if you'd like, you can get the game for free. It is available on PC. I know it's on Steam for free. You can download it. It has not held up great, and it may be very frustrating for a newer audience or people unfamiliar with the genre. But just bear in mind, and I'd say give it a shot if nothing else. The lore is incredible. How quests are done, at least for specific items or factions, can be very good. There is some... there are quests that are repeated in how they work, and because of the way that the dungeons and things like that are generated, you can get stuck in certain situations. So it's a little frustrating at times, but it is at least worth, I think, putting a couple of hours in, if for no other reason than it's free and it's kind of a piece of history. And the world is fantastic, honestly. It's one of my favorite fantasy worlds. And then, of course, you have the big one, the first great game in the series which was the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. There were a couple of fill-in games in between there. But Morrowind kind of set the bar for a lot of people for open world 3D kind of RPGs. And it had a couple of very expansive expansion packs when those were still a thing. And then you later had the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion and Skyrim, which came out in 2010 and has been released several times and re-released several times since then. And they are currently working on the 6th game in the series, but they also have in addition to numerous spin-offs, they also have a online game that's getting regular updates every few months. And that's meant to be played with multiple people. And it's very much an MMO RPG experience. They have, again, critically speaking, most of them have ranked fairly high, at least the main games. They range anywhere between, 7.5s to full 10s out of 10s, depending on, whatever rating system is. And Morrowind has sold, Skyrim itself has sold a very large number of copies. I think it's the most well-sold Western series by far. That's cutting things out like Super Mario. Obviously, that's gonna beat everyone. But for a non-Japanese publisher, I think it's number one all time, as far as I can determine. Of course, those numbers are sometimes fudged by various tracking organizations for a number of different reasons, but that's kind of the general consensus I've been able to find. So, the world itself. So, I already mentioned how this is kind of a offshoot of old school D&D. The games themselves take place on Tamriel. Now, Tamriel is not the planet, it is a continent. And again, the world itself is sometimes referred to as Nirn or Mundus. And all the characters and the races that the characters can be made from, they appear on the continent of Tamriel. But for this world, it came about from a conflict between two ancient beings or gods. Those gods are known as Anu and Padme. They are brothers. They came into, the void, and that is kind of considered when time began. Now, Anu is kind of the force of stability and order, and Padme is kind of course, the force of opposite of that. He is entropy, chaos, what have you. They kind of existed in a balance, but in their kind of playing off of one another, they created a third being. This is a goddess known as Nier, although it could have basically been said to have been a kind of a sort of non-entity, but for whatever reason, the newly created being Nier loved Anu, and not Padme, though they both loved her, but she only preferred Anu. They became a family, and she got pregnant, and Padme kind of tried to get Nier to leave Anu, but she did not want to, so Padme fought and beat her very badly. But Anu comes back from somewhere, and he fights Padme off and casts him outside of time. Nier then gives birth to the rest of creation, and then died from her injuries after that. Anu is grieving this, and he hides himself in the sun and sleeps. But the creation that she gave birth to eventually kind of springs forward from this creation, from basically an egg, as it were. And then this kind of leads to the formation of the next generation of gods. And it takes a long time, but Padme was able to return. He kind of sees this creation and hates it, and he tries to destroy it. And it kind of breaks this world that kind of came about after creation. And then Anu kind of hears this and sees it, and he wakes up and he fights Padme again, and he's wounds Padme badly, and then he tries to kind of fix the remaining aspects of creation, and he kind of takes them all together and forms them into one world, and this is known as Nirn, which is where Tamriel is located. As he's doing this, though, he was struck from the very grievously wounded Padme, and then seeing that he can't really defeat his brother, he grabs a hold of him, and Padme and Anu kind of throw each other outside of time. And then Padme's blood becomes a group known as Daedra, and the blood of Anu becomes kind of the stars in the sky. And the mingled blood of both of them become the Aedra, which is the kind of another generation of gods. And then from there, the Aedra and the Daedra, they kind of don't really react to too much with each other. But the world itself, Nirn, is chaotic. So the only survivors of this kind of climactic struggle are kind of a precursor species that we don't really know too much about, at least in the lore of the world. It's the Elanfe, or Earthbones, which is kind of one of the things I love that they do in this series. When you're studying old texts and things like that, because you can read those in the book as your character. Some of those things will even help you. They will level your skills up if you read them, but some are just to kind of give flavor to the world. But I do love that they will sometimes use phrases that seem odd or out of place to kind of show you that how people refer to things has changed over time, and it also lends an air to mystery, what does that mean? But I do like the idea of the people that come to make up the world are referred to as the Earthbones. There's also another species that are left behind, and this is known as the Hist, which is kind of like a organic semi-plant kind of group, and they kind of give life to trees and swamps and forests and that kind of thing. So you have the Aedra, the Daedra, the Elanfe, the Earthbones, and then you have the Hist. Now, there is one final group that was still around, and it may not even be wise to consider them a group because it's not truly sentient, and that is the eponymous Elder Scrolls. The scrolls are special because they are basically, they're recordings of events and not just past events. They're the future. They record both the past and future, and conceivably, I suppose, the present as well. And they can be read in both ways. They can affect the past even after it's occurred, and the future as well. There are those that can read the scrolls, but usually doing so will eventually cause blindness. But then there are those that are able to kind of do so at specific places or with specific tools and them not be affected. It kind of depends on the person. And the scrolls themselves are also, they exist outside of time. There is not really a record of how many they are. Not because there's a lot of them necessarily, it's just because they can't be known. They cannot be counted, I think, is the way it works. And that's one of those things that's kind of like that mysticism that I kind of enjoy about the world. They're, of course, able to be kept and protected and watched over, and there are groups that do so, but even they recognize the fact that they do not have them all. In fact, it may not even be possible for anyone to own them all. There might be a possibility that they don't allow themselves to be kept anywhere but by where they need to be themselves, or perhaps it is the gods. That's another factor. They are not able to be dated because, again, they exist outside of time. There are those that say they're Adric prophecies, that they were made by the Adra to kind of guide the world that they created, but even that is not a sure thing. That could just be wishful thinking on the part of mortality. So it's a very interesting concept that these exist, and despite the fact that the game kind of takes their name from the series, they're not actually all that prevalent in the series. I think I know that they show up in the 5th and the 4th game, but the 4th game they only show up kind of like in a side quest. It's not something that has to be not something that you have to do as a player. Whereas in Skyrim, you definitely have to find it if you wish to complete a couple of different quest lines. And I'm not so sure about some of the other games, but I don't remember there being any in the 3rd. But I could be wrong about that, I suppose. It has been quite a while since I've played that game the complete way through. Excuse me. So, now all the events that I've kind of referred you to, it takes place in a period of time known as the Dawn Era, and this is a time that is not actually, it can't really be quantified, and what I'm describing and what is described to people in the world, in the lore, may not even be 100% accurate. What may be described as like a physical act of, say, Anu and Padme fighting each other, of Nier giving birth to creation, the egg of creation, that may not have happened. This could very much be just ideas that were bandied about between Anu and Padme, and this didn't actually happen. But it's kind of like it's this period that we're referring to. This may not even be happening in order. That this could be different things happening at different times, and it's just relayed to us in this specific order. This is something that comes up, and also this is the possibility that this is not the first time that this sort of thing has happened. There are numerous places in the lore where the world, or the era that you're living in, this specific time, is known as a kalpa, or an age, or an era. And this may not be the first time that a kalpa has been started or ended. This is specifically, I know it's mentioned in, I forget which of the races have a lore where this, they have like an ancestor who says that he came, or that his father came from a different kalpa, or a different timeline. So there is a very, very real possibility that there are multiple timelines interacting with each other. One of the big events in, I think it's the 2nd game, involves your player character getting a hold of a powerful object, and you then choose which faction you wish to give the artifact to. And in doing so, you finish out the story for the game, at least the main story. But then, of course, there are other games in the series that take place after that. And to kind of explain this choice away, the creators have developed a very interesting kind of storytelling tool that they refer to as a dragon break. This is an instance of, I guess, high prophecy, where where the fate of the world can hinge on a choice, and then they make it so that the dragon break makes knowing what happened impossible. That this is kind of a wound or a spinning of time where the exact order of events isn't knowable. But you just know that how things ended up. And essentially, I think for Daggerfell specifically, which is the second game, what ends up happening is I think you have the option of 7 or 8 choices to make. And then from the way the Dragon Break unfolded, how the world at least was affected from this is that 5 of those endings happened simultaneously. One of the local kings that you've helped in the world, he is able to consolidate the region under his rule, but then he is also placed under control of the Empire, who is also one of the choices, and then a few of the villainous factions end up being destroyed or broken down and exiled. So there's a few different things that happen at once. It's basically kind of a neat way to kind of tie everything in together. And again, it plays with that idea of multiple timelines happening. That is, I think, again, the second game of the series. Most of the games take place in the third era of the world. The fifth one, Elder Scrolls V, takes place in the fourth era, very early in that time, and I think Elder Scrolls Online takes place in the second era. So we have the Dawn era, and then of course from that we have, eventually you get to the first, second, and third eras, but there is a kind of an intermediate period called the Merithic era. This is kind of this is the era of myths, as you could probably tell from the name. So at this point, the world is created as we know it. There is several different kind of ideas of the world forming after that, with the Aedra, the Daedra, and the Elefre and the Hist all kind of playing off one another to create mortality. The Aedra, for a number of different reasons, leave the world and they go to a different plane, or are trapped, or are kind of their physical bodies are destroyed, depending on whose religion you actually believe, which again is one of those other things. The Daedra had no interest in this world, this plane of existence, the one that your players take care in. They have their own planes that are separate from Mundus. They have elements kind of broken off, or remnant of Padme, who is also referred to as Sithis in some cases. So they each have their own plane of existence that they control pretty much omnisciently. And then, of course, they try to... some of them try to pull parts of the mortal world into their own plane or merge them. And then some just don't really care. They're kind of doing their own thing. And whereas the Aedra, the remnants of their powers or their consciousness are kind of watching over the races of mortals. And this is another factor we can get into, and this kind of plays into the idea of elves and men from Tolkien. The mortal races are divided into 3 groups. At least 3 groups on the continent of Tamriel, which is where all the games take place. And that is men, mer, and beast folk. So you have, of course, men, who are the humans. You have Mer, which are the elves, and the beastfolk, which comprise actually a fair number of races, but in terms of human player characters in the games, you only get 2. Now, the Mer, which that's just the kind of the shortened name for them, they have a number of subgroups. You have the Altmer, the Bosmer, the Dunmer, and a few other spin-offs, which again, the first 3 I mentioned are the only player character races. The Altmer are High Elves, the Bosmer are Wood Elves, and the Dunmer are the Dark Elves. Now, they all come from an original kind of source population, known as the Aldmer. That's ALD, not to be confused with the Altmer, which is ALT. That can get confusing if you're not familiar. The Bosmer are wood elves. They live in kind of a deep primordial forest area. And then you have the Dunmer, who are also known as, I think, ash elves or dark elves. They are kind of the more interesting, in my opinion, of the player character races of elves. But that's, of course, just up to preference on my part. Then you have the races of men that you can play as a human. You have the Imperials, you have the Nords, you have the Red Guards, and the Bretons, who are kind of sort of a halfling race. They can also be referred to as Mon Mary, though I think they are firmly considered elves by most, at least in the in-game lore. Then you have the Beastfolk, which most of these are kind of like enemy characters, but there are 2 that are part of the player character choices. Those are the Argonians and the Khajiit. The Argonians are lizard people. They can breathe underwater, which makes them one of the more fun races to play, at least in Morrowind. It's not as much of a mechanic in Skyrim. And then you have the Khajiit, who are just basically giant cats. Now, all of the races have kind of a home province in Tamriel, the continent that you live on, and they all have their own, political organizations, things like that. They all have various skills that they are more, I guess, associated with in terms of gameplay reasons, as well as just parts of tied into lore. The Aldmer are very good at magic. The Dunmer are excellent hunters. They're very proficient with ranged weaponry. I believe they're poison resistant as well, as are the Argonians. I think the Argonians are actually immune to disease. Maybe not poisons. Then you have the various races of men. You have the Imperials, who are very good at commerce, and they are able to communicate well. They have high charisma, I guess you'd consider it. You have the Red Guards, who are excellent warriors. I think they're the best smiths. The Bretons kind of are... They best serve as kind of like a mix between the Imperials and the Altmer. They have a good mix of maybe less direct combat and magic. Now, there is one more race that I forgot to mention, and I'm sorry I did that, and that is the orcs in this game. Now, they are actually a part of the Elvish race, which is kind of, I think it was based off one of Tolkien's early concepts of orcs, and maybe that's the one that he ended up keeping, I think, because I'm not sure if that was ever hashed out. It's been a while since I've read the Lord of the Rings books. But of course, the orcs were, in Tolkien's world, they were originally elves, and they were corrupted by Morgoth first, and then later Sauron. But the orcs in this, they actually followed an Aldmer chief. He kind of led their people out of their homeland to kind of, settle and colonize these new wild lands when he ran into a Daedra, one of the Daedric lords, the Daedric princes, and he challenged them to battle, and the Daedric prince just kind of, literally, I think, in most versions of the story, ate him and then crapped him out. And he was kind of corrupted from that, and he became the orc. And thus that affected the rest of his people. And the orcs, unfortunately, do not have their own region. They occupy their own strongholds. They kind of make these little ring forts, and they kind of sell their services as mercenaries or bodyguards, or just as arena fighters in various parts of the Empire and Tamriel. They have one of the more interesting cultures in the game. And they're very good, of course, at combat, and they have some of the better smithing skills if you wanted to create your own armor or things, weapons, things like that. There are, of course, other versions of these races. There are elves who have gone extinct or have gone missing. Such as the Dwemer, which are their version of the dwarves. So that's one of the things I like about Elder Scrolls. It's a nice twist. Orcs and dwarves are actually elves. They're different than what you would consider kind of the Tolkien elves. They kind of do their own thing. And then you have there are other things as well. You have snow elves who have gone, they were exterminated by the Nords, conquering their region of Tamriel, called Skyrim. You have the left-hand elves who were destroyed by the Red Guards before the Red Guards even got to Tamriel. And then you have a few other races of men who were annihilated by either disease or Argonians, depending on the lore, or just some other beast race. It's kind of it's very interesting backstory, and I do want to kind of get a little bit more information about some of them in some of the future games, but we'll get there eventually. But that kind of goes into the second era that we didn't really talk about, which is the Merethic era, again, the Mythic era. And that kind of explains how all the races formed, how they got where they ended up, and then you get to kind of the more well documented and actually recorded histories. So there are still, these possible mystery or mythic elements that are still kind of coalescing from the Dawn Age, and then those are kind of finishing off as you get to the recorded era. But this is a world of high magic. Magic is a very everyday part of life. There are colleges, organizations built around the use of magic, but then there are those that are excellent fighters, hunters, those kind of things. Some of the races have a mistrust of magic and magic users, and then there are some that that's kind of central to their way of life, to their power. Now there are other continents in the world. There is Akavar, which is kind of the far eastern continent. It has its own races and regions. They're not really seen, at least in the main game. I do think there may have been some, a small number of the NPCs of those races that show up in the Elder Scrolls Online, but they're not really germane to what we'll be talking about, at least going forward. but the world that you kind of end up in as a player character, it's very much kind of a Roman Empire with sorcerers. Might be the best way to put it. Although there are elements, I think it might be better to consider it late Roman Empire, like 3rd or 4th century AD. Not to say that the empire is necessarily in bad shape. It's kind of goes province by province. But the politics of the world is another powerful reason to play it. It's not all cut and dry. Every region has its own ruler or governor, and then those people have to deal with like their own internal politics as well as the overarching politics of the continent. And it really sets up some interesting kind of play-by-play and things kind of get you invested as a player character. And of course, there are just these smaller organizations that have their own internal problems or their own goals that you can kind of join and follow in. You have Fighters Guild in most places, or a version of that. You have a Thieves Guild. You have an Assassin's Secret Society you can join. And of course, Mages, Mage College, Mage Guild. And they all have their own regional kind of flavors. Morrowind is incredible because not only does it have all that, it also has like individual cults or temples worshipping specific gods you can join, both good and bad. And then you have even like you can join Imperial Legions, organizations for political groups in Morrowind where you're playing at. So that game by far has the deepest, I guess, world, like you being able to interact with it. So I think that's the main things to kind of talk about with this. You've got the world, the backstory, you've got the races, and yeah, I think that's kind of a good place to stop for now. I will probably come back to this and maybe do some of my more favorite parts of the game. But yeah, it's a really interesting world. It does a lot of things that no one else does with their lore, both in terms of just creative writing, storytelling, and for game stuff too, like for video games. There's no genre that has tried to rip off the Elder Scrolls, and especially for modern day gaming, where if you have a profitable idea, people will try to steal it. I watched a video, and I forget the person's name, but just doing some research for like how the world was created. There's not a whole lot of people trying to mimic this. Skyrim, again, it's the best-selling Western RPG ever, and no one tried to do anything like it. Then you have something like, say, the world of The Witcher. It has caused several studios to completely rework pre-existing franchises to be closer to The Witcher. Something like Assassin's Creed. They went from being a secret underground assassin society game to like, hey, you're a Viking and you've got to fight monsters just like The Witcher does, and there's magic and there's gods and all this other stuff. And no one's done that with Elder Scrolls. There's not like a Morrowind but with zombies. There's nothing close to it, which I think is kind of says something that if for nothing else, say what you want about modern Bethesda and some of the problems their games do have. There's legitimate criticisms to make about Bethesda as a company, some of the choices they have in these games, even though I think they're all very good. Say what you want about that. I think that they do show real creativity and just passion, and just skill with what they created with Tamriel and the world of the Elder Scrolls. It's something that no one else has really been able to try and do. So I think they deserve some credit for that. But this isn't really a review thing. I would recommend you try it out. I'm not going to give it a rating. Again, Daggerfall is free right now. I think it's always free. In Morrowind and Skyrim, you can usually find on sale. They're not too expensive, especially depending on which version of Skyrim you buy. And with those games, you have a huge community of players who kind of create mods, which is homemade content that they get to add into the games and use those engines. So even though the games themselves are Skyrim, hell, it's over 10 years old now, and that makes me feel very, very old. It's still incredibly deep and still has a very big online community, people supporting it and creating new and different content for it. So it's definitely something to check out. But I think this is a good place to end it. Almost 50 minutes in. I'm gonna have to cut some of this out, especially some of the less interesting parts and the cars going off in my parking lot. But I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed these kind of intermediate or bonus episodes while I've been working on Season 3. We'll be back to that next time. We will be returning to Africa to kind of start our coverage of 8000 BC. I know the first episode, I've actually, as I was kind of outlining it and kind of doing the highlights I wanted to touch on, I did realize that Southern Africa probably will be its own episode again, so I won't have to mash it together with Central and Western Sub-Saharan Africa. So a little bit longer than I thought, which I think is a good thing. So I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you'll continue to listen. If you have not, please subscribe on whatever platform you like to listen on. Tell a friend, that kind of thing. And yeah, I know I mentioned it before, but I do have my YouTube channel up. I am been uploading some of my backlog. Didn't do too many this week. I think I only got like 2 or 3 up. I'm going to try and have some more up this week, but we'll see. But thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.